The silver spoon clicked against the rim of the porcelain cup, a sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo through the stillness of my father's study. Across from me, my brother Marcus adjusted his cufflink, the gold reflecting the afternoon sun that slanted through the heavy velvet curtains. He didn't look at me. He looked at the legal documents spread across the mahogany desk like they were a menu he was casually browsing. My sister, Elena, sat next to him, smelling of expensive jasmine and the cold air of the city she had just flown in from. She was busy checking her reflection in the darkened screen of her phone, tucking a strand of perfect hair behind her ear. I watched the steam rise from my tea, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide the way my fingers were trembling. The air in the room felt thick, tasting of old paper and the lingering scent of the antiseptic wipes I had used to clean this room every single day for the last 5 years. Marcus finally cleared his throat, the sound dry and practiced. He said it was only logical. He said that since I had already been living in the house for years, essentially rent-free, it was only fair that the property be sold and the proceeds split between him and Elena to compensate for their travel expenses and the time they had lost from their careers. He called it a balancing of the scales. He spoke as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away from him. He spoke as if I were a piece of furniture that had come with the estate. My heart began to pound, a heavy, rhythmic thud that I could feel in the base of my throat. It was a suffocating sensation, like a physical weight pressing against my windpipe. I focused on my breathing, keeping it slow and shallow so they wouldn't see the rise and fall of my chest. My palms were damp against the fabric of my skirt. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to sweep the tea set off the table, to hear the porcelain shatter against the floorboards just to see if they would finally look at me. Instead, I gripped the edge of the chair. The wood was cold and hard. I remained perfectly still. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, hollow calmness settling over me, a realization that the people sitting across from me weren't my family anymore. They were just creditors coming to collect on a debt I didn't know. I looked at the way the sunlight hit the dust motes dancing in the air. Everything felt distant, like I was watching a film of my own life. I realized in that moment that they had already decided my worth. To them, my sacrifice wasn't a gift. It was a default setting. I am Sarah. I am 38 years old. For the last half-decade, my identity has been tied entirely to a bedside. I thought that by giving up my career in architectural design to care for our dying father, I was preserving the heart of this family. I believed that love was a currency that would eventually be returned in kind. I was wrong. In this room, surrounded by the books I read to a man who forgot my name months before he died, I am just the extra chair at the table. I am the daughter who stayed because she had the least to lose, or so they thought. Marcus is 42, a partner at a firm that demands 80 hours a week. Elena is 40, a woman whose life is a series of curated gallery openings and first-class lounge photos. They see my 5 years of sleepless nights, the lifting, the cleaning, and the constant, crushing isolation as a hobby I took up to avoid the real world. They think I am weak because I was kind. They think I am silent because I have nothing to say. They truly believe this meeting was the final chapter. They expected me to nod, sign the papers, and move into a small apartment they had graciously scouted for me in a part of town they would never visit. Marcus reached for a fountain pen and pushed a document toward me. He gave me a small, patronizing smile, the kind you give to a child who finally learned to tie their shoes. I looked down at the paper. My name was printed there, waiting for a signature that would erase my history in this house. I didn't pick up the pen. I just looked at him, my gaze steady and level. I thought about the heavy, locked file box sitting under my bed upstairs. I thought about the conversations I had with the family lawyer while Marcus was in Dubai and Elena was in Aspen. They think they know what is in our father's will. They think they know who holds the power of attorney. They are very mistaken. I'm curious about something. Have you ever been the person in your family who was expected to give up everything while everyone else kept moving forward? Have you ever felt that slow, simmering resentment of being the default caregiver, the one who stays behind to do the work no one else wants to do? I'd love to know if I'm the only one who is sat at a table like this, feeling like a stranger among people who share my blood. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. It helps me feel a little less alone in this room. And if you want to hear how this meeting ended, make sure you're following along. 5 years ago, the skin around my eyes didn't have these fine, etched lines of exhaustion. I remember the exact moment the shift happened. It was a Tuesday morning, and the air smelled like rain and wet pavement. I was standing in my office on the 22nd floor, looking out at the city skyline, holding a blueprint for a new library project that I had spent months designing. My phone vibrated on the desk. It was Marcus. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the project. He just told me that Dad had fallen again, and that this time, it was different. He told me that he and Elena had discussed it, and since I was single and my job was flexible, it made the most sense for me to move back into the family home for a few weeks to get things settled. He used the word temporary. He used the word family. I remember looking at the reflection of the sun on the glass towers and feeling a flicker of hesitation. It was a small, quiet doubt that I pushed down because that's what we do for the people we love. I packed a suitcase that night, thinking I'd be back in my own bed by the end of the month. I didn't realize that I was walking into a trap that would take 5 years to spring. I didn't realize that by saying yes to a few weeks, I was saying no to the rest of my life. The city outside my office window felt so bright and full of possibility that morning. Now, sitting in this dark study, that version of myself feels like a ghost. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to remember the smell of that office, the ozone from the printers, and the burnt coffee from the break room. When I opened them, Marcus was still holding the pen out to me. The silence in the room was absolute. I took a slow breath and finally reached for the paper. But I didn't sign it. I just turned it over. Marcus leaned back, the expensive leather of the chair creaking under his weight. It was the same chair I used to help Dad into every morning after his physical therapy, but Marcus sat in it with a different kind of gravity. He sat there like a king who had finally returned to a province he found beneath him. He looked at the document I had turned over, his brow furrowing just a fraction of an inch. That was his tell. A tiny ripple in his composure that meant he was losing patience. He didn't like it when things didn't follow the script he had written in his head. To him, I was a character who only had one line, "Yes, Marcus." He sighed, a long, weary sound of a man who believed his time was being stolen by someone in a lower tax bracket. I didn't move. Not an inch. I kept my gaze fixed on the mahogany grain of the desk, tracing the small circular stain where Dad used to set his water glass every night. Marcus never noticed that stain. He never noticed the way the room smelled of lavender and antiseptic, a scent I had spent years trying to scrub into the floorboards to mask the smell of fading life. He just saw a room that needed to be staged for a high-end real estate listing. "You're being difficult, Sarah," Marcus said. His voice was calm, but it had that razor-sharp edge he used when he was closing a deal. He told me that we needed to be realistic about the market. He told me that holding onto a house this size was a liability, not an investment. He spoke about property taxes and maintenance costs, as if I hadn't been the one paying them out of my own dwindling savings for the last 2 years. I felt a hot, prickling sensation behind my eyes, but I refused to blink. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a tear. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribs, hammering against the bone. I squeezed my hands together in my lap. I felt the sharp edge of my fingernails digging into my palms. The pain was grounding. It was a reminder that I was still here. I remembered a Tuesday 3 years ago. It was raining, a cold, gray drizzle that turned the garden into a swamp of mud and dead leaves. Dad had caught a fever, and his breathing had turned into a terrifying, wet rattle. I called Marcus 6 times. He didn't pick up. When he finally called back 3 days later, he told me he had been at a retreat in the Hamptons and that his phone reception was spotty. He told me that I needed to learn how to handle these little hiccups on my own. He said that's why I was there. He said it was my contribution to the family. I spent that night sitting on the floor by Dad's bed, counting his breaths, terrified that each one would be the last. I was alone. I was always alone, Elena finally looked up from her phone, her expression one of practiced sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine but never actually making contact. She told me she understood how hard this was for me. She said that because I had been so insulated from the world, the idea of moving on must be overwhelming. She used that word, insulated, as if spending 5 years changing diapers and managing morphine drips was a vacation from reality. She told me that she had already found a lovely 2-bedroom apartment near the park. She said it was perfect for someone with my lifestyle. She meant it was perfect for a middle-aged woman with no career and no prospects. She smiled, and for a second, I saw the little girl who used to break my dolls and tell me it was an accident. She hadn't changed. She had just gotten more expensive clothes. I thought about my office in the city. I thought about the drafting table I had sold to pay for Dad's specialized hospital bed when the insurance company refused to cover it. I thought about the partner track I had been on, the late nights spent over blueprints, the feeling of a building rising from the ground because of my designs. That woman was gone. She had been replaced by a woman who knew the exact schedule of a local pharmacy and how to get a stubborn old man to eat mashed peas. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss, a grief that had nothing to do with my father's death and everything to do with the person I had allowed myself to become for their sake. I looked at Elena's perfectly manicured nails. They were the color of a winter sky. I leaned forward, my movement slow and deliberate. I felt the air in the room shift. Marcus straightened his posture. Elena's smile faltered. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was battered, the edges frayed from years of being carried in my pocket. I laid it on top of the document Marcus had pushed toward me. It looked small and insignificant against the legal-sized paper, but it was the heaviest thing in the room. "This isn't about the market, Marcus," I said. My voice was steady. It was lower than I expected it to be. I told him that I had kept a record. I told him that every cent I had spent, every hour I had logged, and every conversation I had with Dad's doctors was in that book. I told him that I also had the records of every time I had asked them for help and been told they were too busy. I saw Marcus's jaw tighten. I saw the way his eyes darted to the notebook and then back to me. He wasn't looking through me anymore. He was looking at me. Truly looking at me. It was the first time in years. I remember the day Dad had his last lucid moment. It was a few months before the end. The sun was hitting the bookshelf just right, illuminating the old leather spines. He looked at me. And for the first time in a long time, his eyes weren't cloudy. He took my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. He told me that he knew what they were planning. He told me that he had seen the way Marcus looked at the house during his brief, 15-minute visits. He told me that he wouldn't let them erase me. He whispered a name and a number. He told me to go to the safe in the basement, the one behind the old workbench that no one used anymore. He told me that I was the only one he trusted. I didn't tell my siblings. I didn't tell anyone. I just nodded and kissed his forehead, feeling the paper-thin skin against my lips. I kept that secret for months, carrying it like a coal in my chest. It warmed me when the house felt too cold. It kept me going when I thought I couldn't do it for another day. Marcus laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He told me that a diary didn't change the law. He told me that as the eldest son and the executor of the estate, he had the final say. He said that my sentimental accounting was pathetic. He reached for the notebook, intending to swish it aside, but I placed my hand firmly on top of it. My skin felt cold against the leather. I looked him dead in the eye. I didn't blink. "I am not the executor, Marcus," I said. The words felt like stones in my mouth, heavy and solid. I watched the blood drain from his face. Elena froze, her phone halfway to her ear. The silence that followed was so absolute I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen 3 rooms away. It was a beautiful, terrifying silence. I wondered what they would do if they knew the truth. I wondered if they would still be sitting there, acting like they were doing me a favor, if they knew that the power had already shifted. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, electric buzz that made my fingertips tingle. It was the feeling of a hunter who had finally cornered their prey after years of being the one hunted. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. I felt a cold, clear sense of justice that was more intoxicating than any wine. I looked at the two of them, the high-powered lawyer and the socialite, and I realized they were small. They were tiny, fragile people built on a foundation of unearned confidence. And I was the one who held the sledgehammer. Have you ever felt that moment? That split second where the person who has been stepping on you realizes you're the one holding the floor up? It's a strange kind of peace. It's the kind of peace that comes after a long, exhausting war. I'd love to hear about the times you've had to stand your ground against people who thought you were a pushover. Tell me your stories in the comments. It reminds me why I'm doing this. Marcus finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly. He asked me what I was talking about. He said the will was clear. He said the 2018 version was the last one on file. I saw his hand tremble as he reached for his water glass. He took a sip, but I could tell his throat was dry. I didn't answer him right away. I let the question hang in the air, let it fester and grow until it filled the room. I looked at the clock on the wall. 3:15. The lawyer would be arriving in exactly 45 minutes. I had 45 minutes to watch them squirm. I had 45 minutes to enjoy the look of dawning horror on their faces. I picked up my teacup and took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea was cold. I didn't care. I remembered the time Marcus bought his third vacation home. He sent a photo of the infinity pool to the family group chat. I was in the middle of cleaning up a broken vase that Dad had knocked over in a fit of confusion. I remember looking at the blue water in the photo and then looking at the shards of glass on the floor. I remember thinking about how much that pool cost, how many years of professional help it could have bought for Dad, how many hours of sleep it could have bought for me. I didn't reply to the message. I just swept up the glass and went back to work. Now, looking at Marcus's pale face, I realized that pool was going to be very expensive to maintain without the inheritance he was counting on. The thought was a sharp, jagged pleasure. Elena started to babble. She told me I was being crazy. She said that Dad wasn't in his right mind for the last year. She said that any new document wouldn't hold up in court. She started talking about undue influence and mental capacity. She was using the words she had heard in legal dramas, tossing them out like life rafts. I just watched her. I watched her perfectly applied lipstick smudge as she bit her lip. I watched the way she couldn't stop fidgeting with her gold bracelets. They clinked together, a frantic, metallic sound. You should have visited more, Elena, I said. I told her that if she had come by for more than a holiday photo op, she might have known how sharp Dad was until the very end. I told her that he was more present than she ever was. I saw her flinch. It was a small victory, but I savored it. I felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over me, the kind that starts in your marrow and seeps outward. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the raw, aching reality of the last 5 years. I looked around the study, the room where I had spent so many hours listening to the clock tick while Dad slept. I realized that I didn't want this house. I didn't want the mahogany desk or the velvet curtains. I wanted my life back. I wanted the 5 years they had stolen from me. But since I couldn't have that, I would take the only thing they valued. I would take their security. I would take their comfort. I would take the very thing they thought they were entitled to. I looked at the back of the document again. It was still blank. It was a void, waiting to be filled with the consequences of their choices. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. Marcus saw it. He recoiled as if I had struck him. Good, I thought. He should be afraid. I set the cup down. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Marcus's face went through a series of rapid, twitching transformations. First, there was shock, then a flash of pure, unadulterated anger, and finally a hollow sort of confusion that made him look older than his 42 years. He looked like a man who had walked into his own house only to find the locks had been changed and the furniture rearranged by a ghost. He didn't believe me. I could see the denial written in the sharp line of his jaw and the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the desk. He told me I was lying. He told me that Dad would never have done something so significant without consulting him. He said the word consulting as if he were a board member and Dad was merely a subsidiary of the family brand. It was a laughable thought. Marcus hadn't consulted Dad about anything for a decade, except perhaps to ask for a loan to cover a dip in his hedge fund's performance. The silence in the room became a physical presence. It sat between us, heavy and cold, like a block of ice that refused to melt. I watched Marcus's chest heave as he tried to regain his composure. He was a man who lived for the gotcha moment in a courtroom, but he had never been on the receiving end of one. I felt a strange, detached sense of pity for him. He was so convinced of his own importance that he had forgotten that power isn't just given, it's earned through presence. And he had been absent for so long he was practically a memory in this house. My heart was still thudding against my ribs, a dull, repetitive ache, but my voice remained as smooth as the polished wood of the desk. I told him he should check his email. I told him that Mr. Henderson, Dad's attorney for 30 years, had sent over a formal notice of the updated estate plan 6 months ago. I told him it was likely sitting in his low-priority folder, right next to the updates on Dad's declining kidney function that he also never bothered to read. I remember a specific Tuesday in November. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, and a biting wind was rattling the window panes in Dad's bedroom. I was sitting in the armchair by the heater, knitting a scarf I knew I'd never finish, while Dad stared out at the garden. He had been quiet for hours. Then, out of nowhere, he asked me if I remembered the summer Marcus turned 16. I did. Marcus had crashed the car and Dad had spent the entire season working extra shifts at the hospital to pay for the repairs and the insurance hike. Dad told me that Marcus had never once said thank you. He told me that Marcus had just expected the world to fix itself around him. He looked at me then, his eyes clear and piercing in a way they hadn't been in weeks. He told me that he didn't want the house to be a trophy for someone who didn't know how to care for a home. He told me that he wanted the walls to belong to someone who had actually lived within them. That was the day we called Mr. Henderson. The air in the room that day had smelled of peppermint tea and the metallic tang of the heater. I felt a lump in my throat now just thinking about the weight of his hand on mine as he signed those papers. It wasn't about the money. It was about the truth. Elena finally spoke, her voice high and brittle. She asked how I could have done this. She said I had manipulated a sick, elderly man for my own gain. She used the word gain as if I were a thief who had broken into a vault, rather than the woman who had spent 5 years sacrificing her youth to ensure our father died with dignity. I looked at her. I looked at the way her expensive diamond earrings caught the light, sparkling with a cold, artificial brilliance. I asked her when she last visited. I asked her if she remembered the name of the nurse who came 3 times a week, or the color of the pills Dad had to take every morning at 6. She went quiet. She didn't have an answer. She didn't have a single memory of this house. That wasn't filtered through the lens of an inheritance. The injustice of her accusation felt like a physical blow to my stomach, a sharp, twisting pain that made me want to double over. But I didn't move. I kept my spine straight. I let the silence do the talking for me. You think this is about greed, Elena? I asked. My voice was a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. I told her that I had spent my entire 30s in this house. I told her that while she was at the Paris Fashion Week, I was learning how to use a suction machine to clear a man's lungs so he wouldn't suffocate in his sleep. I told her that while Marcus was buying a yacht, I was selling my car to pay for the roof repair that Dad was too proud to ask them for. I didn't want the money. I wanted the respect. I wanted them to acknowledge that my life had value, even if it didn't come with a 6-figure bonus or a corner office. They looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. To them, time was only valuable if it could be billed to a client. They couldn't conceive of a sacrifice that didn't have a return on investment. I wonder if you've ever been the one who did all the work while someone else expected to take all the credit. It's a bitter pill to swallow, isn't it? Knowing that you've built something with your own sweat and tears, only to have people who never even lifted a finger try to claim it as their own. I'd love to hear your experiences with family members who only show up when there's something to be gained. It makes me realize that my story isn't as unique as I thought it was. Drop a comment and let's talk about it. It helps to know there are others out there who have had to find their own justice. Marcus stood up suddenly, his chair screeching against the floorboards. It was a violent, jarring sound that made Elena jump. He started pacing the length of the study, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He told me he was going to contest it. He told me he'd have the newel thrown out before the end of the month. He used terms like undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. He was back in his element now, the aggressive litigator who thought every problem could be solved by a sufficiently expensive lawsuit. I watched him pace. He looked like a caged animal, pacing back and forth in a prison of his own making. I felt a strange, cold calm. I knew something he didn't. I knew that Mr. Henderson hadn't just updated the will. He had also filmed the entire signing process. I had the video on an encrypted drive in the safe. I had a 4-hour recording of Dad explaining exactly why he was doing what he was doing. I had him on camera, clear-eyed and firm, saying that Marcus and Elena had already received their inheritance through the decades of financial support and elite education he had provided, and that this house was my reward for the years they refused to give. I thought about the night we made that video. It was raining then, too. Dad was sitting in his favorite wingback chair, wearing his old cardigan with the frayed sleeves. He looked into the lens and spoke with a strength I hadn't seen in him for a long time. He said that a family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up when the lights go out. He said that Marcus and Elena were his children, but I was his daughter. The distinction was subtle, but it meant everything. I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye, but I blinked it away. I wouldn't let them see me vulnerable. Not today. Not ever again. I reached out and took the legal document Marcus had pushed toward me earlier. I didn't sign it. I slowly and deliberately tore it in half. Then I tore it in half again. The sound of the paper ripping was the most satisfying thing I had heard in 5 years. Marcus stopped pacing. He stared at the scraps of paper on the desk as if they were the remains of his own life. His face was a mask of disbelief. Elena let out a small, strangled sob and buried her face in her hands. She was crying, but I knew her tears weren't for Dad. They were for the life she had already spent the money on in her head. They were for the loss of the easy path. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. The war wasn't coming. The war was already over. I had won the moment I decided to stop being their victim. I looked at the clock on the wall again. 3:40. 20 minutes until the lawyer arrived. 20 minutes of watching the people who had dismissed me for years realize that I was the one who held the keys to their future. I remember the way Marcus used to talk down to me at Thanksgiving. He'd ask me how my little projects were going, his tone dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. He'd talk about his latest merger or his newest client, making sure everyone at the table knew who the successful one was. I'd just sit there and pass the gravy, my anger a cold, hard knot in my chest. I remember the way Elena would look at my clothes, her eyes scanning for a label she recognized and finding only department store basics. They thought they were better than me because they had more. They never realized that having more also meant having more to lose. And now, they were losing everything. It was a poetic kind of justice. It was a quiet, cinematic ending to a long and noisy drama. I stood up, my movements fluid and confident. I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight that had been pressing on my shoulders for 5 years had finally lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose that was electrifying. I told them they were welcome to stay for the meeting with Mr. Henderson, but that it wouldn't change anything. I told them that the house was mine. I told them that the accounts were mine. And then I told them the one thing I knew would hurt the most. I told them they had 24 hours to pack their things and leave. Marcus turned to me, his eyes bulging. "You can't do that," he hissed. I looked at him and smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally learned how to play the game. I told him to watch me. I told him that I was the one in charge now. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the hardwood with a sharp, definitive rhythm. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where I was going. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the shadows stretching out to meet me. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of running down this same hallway as a child, my laughter echoing off the walls. Back then, we were just 3 kids playing tag, unaware of the cracks that would eventually pull us apart. I felt a brief flicker of sadness for those children, for the family we could have been if greed and arrogance hadn't gotten in the way. But the feeling passed quickly. It was a ghost of a thought, a remnant of a version of myself that no longer existed. I reached the front door and pulled it open, breathing in the cold, crisp afternoon air. It tasted like freedom. It tasted like the start of something new. I stood on the porch and watched a black car pull into the driveway. Mr. Henderson had arrived. The final act was about to begin. I smoothed my hair and waited. I was ready. I was more than ready. Mr. Henderson walked up the porch steps with the slow, rhythmic gait of a man who had seen 1,000 families tear themselves apart over mahogany sideboards and silver tea sets. He was carrying a briefcase that looked older than I was, a heavy, scarred thing of dark leather that smelled faintly of cedar and the kind of expensive tobacco our father used to smoke before the doctors made him stop. He didn't look at Marcus or Elena as he entered the house. He looked only at me. He gave a slight, respectful nod, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that felt like a silent apology for the storm he was about to unleash. I led him back into the study, the room that had just been the site of my siblings' calculated cruelty. The air in there was still thick with their indignation, a heavy, cloying scent that made me want to throw open every window in the house. Marcus and Elena followed us like shadows, their footsteps sounding hollow on the hardwood. Marcus was trying to fix his tie, his fingers fumbling with the silk, while Elena kept wiping at her eyes, her mascara leaving faint, jagged tracks down her cheeks. They looked small in the presence of the law. They looked like children caught in a lie they couldn't talk their way out of. I sat back down in my chair, the one I had occupied for 5 years as a servant, but now it felt like a throne. My heart was still doing that strange, rhythmic dance against my ribs, a sharp thud-thud-thud that I could feel in the tips of my fingers. My palms were damp, so I smoothed them over the fabric of my trousers, the friction providing a small, grounding sensation. Mr. Henderson sat across from me, placing his briefcase on the desk with a heavy thud. The sound was so final. It was a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. He didn't rush. He took out a pair of spectacles and polished them with a silk cloth, his movements deliberate and calm. I watched him, my breath shallow and controlled. I was a blueprint of a woman, a series of straight lines and sharp angles, holding myself together by sheer force of will. I remember a winter evening 4 years ago, when the heater had failed and the house was as cold as a tomb. I had called Marcus to ask for his help paying for a specialized repairman because my own savings were nearly gone. He had laughed. He told me that if I couldn't manage a house, I shouldn't be living in one. He told me he was at a black tie gala and couldn't be bothered with domestic trifles. I spent that night wrapped in 3 blankets, sitting on the floor of Dad's room, blowing on his hands to keep them warm. The injustice of that memory flared up in me now, a hot, white light that burned away any lingering traces of guilt. Marcus had been at a gala. I had been freezing in the dark. Now, the roles were reversed. I was the one in the warmth. He was the one standing in the cold. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound dry and dusty. He looked at Marcus and Elena over the top of his glasses. He told them that he was here at the request of their father, and that the documents he was about to present had been executed over a year ago. He used the word irrevocable. He used the word absolute. I watched Marcus's face. The color was starting to return to his cheeks, but it was a deep, angry crimson. He stepped forward, his hand out as if he could snatch the papers out of the air. He started to talk about the 2018 will again, about how Dad was fragile and susceptible to influence. He was a lawyer, and he was trying to build a case in real time. I felt a flicker of amusement. It was like watching a man try to hold back a tidal wave with a plastic shovel. I am not finished, Marcus, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his rambling like a knife through silk. I told him that the will was only one part of the story. I told him that I had been granted full power of attorney, both medical and financial, years ago. I told him that I had been the one managing every single account, every investment, and every penny of Dad's estate while they were busy living their lives. I saw his eyes widen. He hadn't considered the accounts. He had only been thinking about the real estate. He had been thinking about the house as a physical object to be sold, not as a symbol of the wealth he assumed was still sitting in the bank. I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a stack of bank statements. I laid them out like a deck of cards. The silence that followed was different than before. This silence was heavy with the weight of numbers. I told them that the medical care Dad required was astronomically expensive. I told them about the private nurses, the specialized equipment, and the experimental treatments that had kept him comfortable for those extra years. I told them that because Marcus and Elena had refused to contribute a single cent, I had been forced to liquidate certain assets to cover the costs. I watched Marcus's eyes scan the numbers. I saw the moment he realized that the huge inheritance he had been counting on was significantly smaller than he imagined. I saw the moment he realized that the money he had already mentally spent on a new firm and a bigger boat didn't exist anymore. It had been spent on Dad's dignity. It had been spent on the very thing they hadn't cared about. I thought about the time Marcus bragged about his new watch. It was a vintage piece, worth more than a year of my salary. He had shown it to me during a 10-minute visit, his eyes shining with the pride of a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. I had looked at that watch and thought about the prescription Dad needed that insurance wouldn't cover. I hadn't said anything then. I had just offered him a cup of coffee and listened to him talk about his grind. Now, looking at his pale, sweating face, I realized that his watch was probably the only thing of value he had left that wasn't tied up in debt. The satisfaction was a cold, sharp blade. Elena started to shake. She asked about her trust. She asked about the jewelry Dad had promised her, the pearls our mother had worn, the emerald ring that had been in the family for generations. She sounded like a panicked child. I looked at her, my expression unreadable. I told her that those items were still in the safe. I told her that according to the updated terms, they were to be held in trust by me, to be distributed at my discretion based on demonstrated familial commitment. I used the legal jargon Dad and Mr. Henderson had crafted. I saw her mouth drop open. She realized she would have to come to me, to beg me, if she ever wanted to see those pearls again. She would have to be nice to the boring sister. She would have to earn what she thought was her birthright. Mr. Henderson began to read. His voice was a steady drone, a litany of legal clauses and technical definitions. He spoke about equitable distribution and fiduciary duty. He spoke about the video evidence of Dad's mental clarity. Each word was a nail in the coffin of their expectations. I watched them as they listened. Marcus was staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Elena was slumped in her chair, her eyes glazed over. They were no longer the power players of the family. They were just two people who had bet everything on a man they had ignored, and they had lost. The house felt larger suddenly, as if the walls were expanding to accommodate the truth. Do you know what it's like to be the one holding all the cards after years of being treated like the discard pile? It's a dizzying, terrifying kind of power. It makes you realize that justice isn't something that just happens. It's something you have to carefully, quietly build. I spent 5 years building this moment. I spent 5 years being the good daughter while I was secretly the architect of their downfall. I'd love to hear if you've ever had to play a long game to get what you deserve. Have you ever had to hide your strength until the perfect moment? Let me know in the comments. It's a lonely path, but the view from the end is worth it. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 4. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the desk. Mr. Henderson finished reading and looked up. He asked if there were any questions. Marcus didn't say anything. He just turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy and uncoordinated. Elena followed him, a small, broken sound escaping her throat. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at Mr. Henderson. They just left. The front door slammed a few seconds later, a sound that reverberated through the entire house. I sat there in the silence, my hands finally still. The storm had passed. The air felt clear. Mr. Henderson began to pack up his briefcase. He didn't say much. He just told me that he would handle the filings and that I should call him if I needed anything else. He paused at the door, looking back at me. "Your father was very proud of you, Sarah," he said. He told me that Dad knew exactly what he was doing. He told me that Dad wanted me to have the last word. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, a reminder of the man who was no longer there to see this. But underneath the grief, there was a solid, immovable sense of peace. I had done what I had to do. I had protected the home. I had protected myself. I walked Mr. Henderson to the door and watched him drive away. The street was quiet, the neighborhood settled into its afternoon lull. I stood on the porch for a long time, breathing in the cold air. I looked at the house, the peeling paint on the shutters, the overgrown garden, the roof that needed work. It was mine. It was all mine. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I didn't feel like a servant. I felt like a woman who had finally come home to herself. I went back inside and locked the door. The sound of the bolt clicking home was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I was alone, but for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel lonely. I felt powerful. I went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. I needed a cup of tea. I needed to sit in the quiet and think about what came next. I thought about the office I had left behind, the blueprints I had abandoned. I wondered if I could still draw a straight line. I wondered if the city still felt the same. I looked at my hands. They were the hands of a caregiver, but they were also the hands of a builder. I realized that I didn't have to choose between those two versions of myself. I could be both. I could be the woman who stayed and the woman who left. I just had to decide which one I wanted to be first. The water began to boil, the whistle a sharp, rising note in the still house. It was time to start. It was finally time to live. The house felt different now. The silence wasn't the heavy, expectant quiet of a sick room anymore. It was the silence of an empty theater after a long, exhausting performance. I stood in the kitchen, watching the steam curl from the kettle, a thin, white ribbon in the fading light. The sound of the boiling water was the only thing filling the space that used to be crowded with the hum of oxygen concentrators and the soft, repetitive shuffling of a man who had forgotten how to walk. I reached for a mug, the blue one with the chipped handle that Dad always preferred. It felt surprisingly heavy in my hand. I thought about the thousands of times I had filled it. I thought about the thousands of times I had washed it, dried it, and put it back in the exact same spot on the shelf. My life had been a loop of small, repetitive actions designed to keep another person alive. Now, the loop was broken. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of vertigo. It was the dizzying realization that I no longer had to answer to anyone. I remember the Thanksgiving of 2022. The table was a masterpiece of linen and silver, a display of domestic perfection that I had spent 3 days preparing while Dad was in the middle of a particularly bad flare-up. Marcus had arrived late, smelling of expensive leather and cold air, talking loudly into his headset about a merger that was going to make him a kingmaker. Elena had spent the first hour criticizing the seating arrangement and the second hour explaining why she couldn't eat anything on the menu because of her new cleanse. Neither of them had asked me how I was. Neither of them had noticed the dark circles under my eyes or the way my hands shook as I carved the turkey. To them, I wasn't a sister. I was the caterer. I was the staff. I remember sitting at the end of the table, listening to them discuss their upcoming trip to St. Bart's, feeling like a ghost at my own feast. Marcus had toasted to family, and I had watched the way the wine caught the light in his glass. He didn't see me. I was just the person who made sure the gravy was hot. That memory felt like a cold stone in my stomach. It reminded me why I couldn't feel guilty about the papers on the desk. They had turned me into a ghost long before Dad died. I took my tea back into the study. The scraps of the document I had torn up were still scattered on the floor, little white flakes of a future that Marcus had assumed was his. I didn't pick them up. I wanted to see them there for a while. I wanted to be reminded of the moment the power shifted. I sat in Dad's chair and looked at the safe in the corner. It was a heavy iron beast hidden behind a false panel of books. I knew the combination by heart. I had opened it hundreds of times to retrieve documents or medication logs, but this time was different. This time, I was looking for the things that weren't listed in the will. I was looking for the pieces of myself that had been locked away for 5 years. I felt a surge of nervous energy, a jittery sensation in my stomach that made me feel like a teenager again. I reached for the handle. My fingers were cold. The door of the safe swung open with a soft, metallic groan. Inside, there were the usual things: deeds, titles, insurance policies. But tucked into the back, behind a stack of old tax returns, was a small, wooden box. It was carved with intricate patterns of vines and leaves, a gift Dad had brought back from a trip to Italy decades ago. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. My heart was racing now, a fast, light patter that made it hard to breathe. I opened the lid. Inside was a set of keys and a single, handwritten note. The handwriting was shaky, the letters sprawling across the page in the messy script of a man whose body was failing, but whose mind was still sharp. It was dated only a few weeks before he died. It said, "To my daughter, who stayed. The city is still there, Sarah. Go build something beautiful." I stared at the note until the words blurred into gray smudges. He knew. He had always known what I was giving up. He hadn't just been a passive recipient of my care, he had been a witness to my sacrifice. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. All those years, I had thought I was invisible. I thought my silence was being taken for granted, but he had been watching. He had seen the way I looked at the architecture magazines that piled up on the coffee table. He had seen the way I traced the lines of the buildings in the city from the window. He hadn't just left me a house. He had given me permission to leave it. I felt a sob rise in my throat, a messy, uncoordinated sound that broke the silence of the room. I let it out. I let all of it out: the grief, the anger, the exhaustion. I cried for the 5 years I had lost. I cried for the woman I used to be. I cried because I was finally, truly alone. The house was quiet. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, the skin feeling raw and sensitive. I looked at the keys in the box. They weren't keys to this house. They were keys to a small studio apartment in the city, a place Dad had kept for years as a private office that Marcus and Elena didn't even know existed. It was my escape hatch. It was my bridge back to the world. I felt a sudden, fierce sense of gratitude. He had understood the trap better than I had. He knew that the house would be a burden, a reminder of the duty that had consumed me. He wanted me to have a place where I wasn't a caregiver. He wanted me to have a place where I was just Sarah. I gripped the keys tightly in my palm, the metal edges digging into my skin. It was a good pain. It was the pain of a new beginning. I wondered what Marcus would say if he knew about the apartment. I could almost hear his voice, dripping with indignation, complaining about the waste of assets. He would see it as a missed opportunity for a rental income or a capital gain. He wouldn't understand that for me. It was a lifeline. I felt a surge of pride in my father. He had outplayed them all. He had seen through their masks and recognized the one person who had actually loved him. I realized then that I wasn't just his daughter. I was his partner. We had played the long game together, two people trapped in a house, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thought made me smile. It was a dark, private smile that I shared with the empty room. Have you ever had someone truly see you when you thought you were invisible? It's a powerful thing. It changes the way you look at the world. It makes you realize that even in the middle of a struggle, there might be someone watching, someone who understands what you're going through. I'd love to know if you've ever had a witness in your life, someone who saw your sacrifice when no one else did. Tell me about them in the comments. It's those people who keep us going when the world feels too heavy. Let's share those stories. It helps to remember that we aren't as alone as we think we are. I stood up and walked to the window. The streetlights were flickering on, casting a pale, yellow glow over the sidewalk. I saw a neighbor walking their dog, the small animal tugging at the leash with a frantic energy. Life was moving on outside these walls. The world hadn't stopped just because my father had. I looked at my reflection in the glass. My hair was a mess and my face was pale, but my eyes were bright. They were the eyes of a woman who had a plan. I wasn't going to stay in this house and rot. I was going to fix it, sell it, and move back to the city. I was going to pick up where I left off, but with a clarity I never had before. I was going to build something that would last. I was going to be the architect of my own life. The first step was the hardest. I had to go through the rest of the house. I had to touch every object, decide what to keep and what to throw away. I had to erase the smell of the sick room and replace it with the smell of fresh paint and possibility. I started in the kitchen. I threw away the half-empty boxes of medical supplies and the jars of tasteless baby food. I scrubbed the counters until they shone. Each movement was a prayer. Each action was a step toward freedom. I felt a sudden burst of energy, a physical lightness that made me want to run. I didn't stop until the kitchen was spotless. I stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, my chest heaving. I felt alive. I felt dangerous. I remember the way Elena used to talk about my domesticity. She'd tell me that I had a knack for taking care of things, as if it were a natural talent rather than a grueling, daily labor. She used it as an excuse to never help. "Oh, Sarah's so much better at it than I am," she'd say, her voice light and airy. It was a way to keep me in my place. It was a way to make my labor invisible. I looked at the clean kitchen and realized that I wasn't better at it. I was just the only one who cared enough to do it. And now I was done. I wasn't going to take care of anyone else's messes ever again. If Marcus and Elena wanted to live in a world of perfection, they could build it themselves. I was moving on. I was finally moving on. I went upstairs to my bedroom. It was a small, cramped room at the back of the house, filled with furniture that had been relegated there because no one else wanted it. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the suitcase I had packed 5 years ago. It was still in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were my old work clothes, a charcoal gray suit, a few silk blouses, a pair of heels I hadn't worn in years. They smelled of dry cleaning and a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I touched the fabric of the suit. It felt stiff and unfamiliar. I wondered if it would still fit. I wondered if the woman who wore it was still in there somewhere. I took a deep breath and pulled the suit out of the suitcase. It was time to find out. It was time to see if I could still play the part. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my last day at the office. I had been standing in the lobby, waiting for the elevator, when my boss had come up to me. He told me that he was sorry I had to leave. He told me that I was one of the best designers he had ever seen. He told me that the door would always be open. I had smiled and told him I'd be back in a few weeks. I hadn't known then that it would be 5 years. I hadn't known that the door would feel so heavy when I finally tried to open it again. I looked at the suit and then at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look like a high-powered architect. I looked like a woman who had been through a war. But wars change people. They make you stronger. They make you resilient. I put the suit on. It was a bit loose around the waist, but the shoulders still fit perfectly. I stood up straight and looked at myself. I was still Sarah. I was just a version of Sarah that knew how to fight. I went back downstairs, my heels clicking on the stairs. The sound was a challenge to the silence of the house. I went to the safe and took out the keys to the apartment. I put them in my pocket. I took the note from my father and folded it carefully, tucking it into my wallet. I didn't need anything else from this room. I didn't need the mahogany desk or the velvet curtains. I had everything I needed. I walked to the front door and opened it. The night air was cold, but I didn't care. I stepped out onto the porch and looked at the stars. They were bright and clear, like a map of the future. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The house was behind me. The city was ahead of me. And for the first time in 5 years, I knew exactly where I was going. I got into my car and started the engine. The sound was a low, steady thrum that felt like a heartbeat. I put the car in gear and drove down the driveway, leaving the shadows of the house behind. I drove through the quiet neighborhood, past the dark houses and the empty playgrounds. I drove until I reached the highway, the lights of the city shimmering on the horizon like a promise. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. I was free. I was finally, truly free. I reached out and turned on the radio. A song was playing, something fast and upbeat, something I didn't recognize. I started to hum along. It was a good song. It was the song of my new life. I pressed down on the accelerator and felt the car surge forward. The city was waiting. And I was coming home. The skyline of the city appeared through the windshield, a jagged line of light and glass. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the same feeling I used to get before a big presentation. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mind was clear. I was no longer the woman who stayed. I was the woman who left. I thought about Marcus and Elena, probably huddled together in a bar somewhere, complaining about the unfairness of it all. I thought about the way they would try to call me tomorrow, their voices full of fake concern and hidden agendas. I wasn't going to answer. I was going to change my number. I was going to change my life. I was going to build something that was mine and mine alone. The road stretched out before me, black and smooth. I was moving fast. I was never going back. The skyline of the city didn't just appear, it loomed, a jagged crown of glass and steel piercing the low-hanging clouds of the evening. As I drove across the bridge, the rhythmic thrum of the tires over the expansion joints felt like a countdown, a steady ticking toward the moment I would finally cross the threshold back into my own life. The air inside the car was quiet, save for the low hum of the heater, but outside, the world was a riot of motion. Yellow cabs darted through traffic like frantic schools of fish, and the neon signs of the shops in Queens flickered with a desperate, artificial energy. I gripped the steering wheel, my leather gloves squeaking against the rim. My knuckles were white. I could feel the cold metal of the apartment keys pressed against my thigh through the fabric of my suit. I wasn't just driving toward a destination. I was driving toward a resurrection. I pulled into the parking garage on 42nd Street, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and the metallic tang of exhaust. The attendant gave me a bored nod as I took the ticket, his eyes barely registering my existence. It was a beautiful feeling. In the house, I was the sun around which everything else orbited, the center of every crisis and every mundane need. Here, I was a shadow. I was a ghost. I was just another woman in a gray suit, moving through the city at night. I stepped out of the car and felt the weight of the city settle over me, a heavy, vibrating pressure that I had forgotten I loved. I walked toward the elevator, my heels sounding like gunshots in the quiet of the garage. I pressed the button for the 12th floor. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I remember a rainy afternoon 4 years ago. I had been in the city for a rare 3-hour window of freedom, standing in a small gallery in Chelsea, looking at a series of architectural sketches. I felt a fleeting, electric sense of inspiration, a reminder of the woman who used to stay up until 3 in the morning obsessing over the curve of a staircase. Then my phone had buzzed. It was Marcus. He was 3 blocks away, at a lunch meeting, but he had called to tell me that the grocery delivery at the house was 10 minutes late and Dad was getting agitated. He didn't offer to go. He didn't offer to help. He just wanted me to know that there was a problem he wasn't going to solve. I had walked out of the gallery, leaving the inspiration behind, and spent the next hour on the phone with a customer service representative while sitting on a cold stone bench in the rain. Marcus had seen me through the window of the restaurant. He had waved. He hadn't come outside. The elevator doors opened on the 12th floor, and I stepped out into a hallway that smelled of floor wax and old paper. It was a quiet building, mostly occupied by architects and independent consultants who preferred the charm of pre-war ceilings to the clinical glass of the newer towers. I found the door with a small, brass plate that read Grant and Associates. It was my father's old firm, the one he had retired from long before he got sick, but he had kept this one room as his sanctuary. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, oiled precision that made my heart leap. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was still and cool, smelling of cedar and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco Dad hadn't smoked in a decade. I didn't turn on the lights. I let the glow from the city outside illuminate the room. It was perfect. There was a drafting table by the window, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. There were shelves lined with leather-bound books and rolls of old blueprints. There was a small kitchenette in the corner and a narrow sofa covered in a navy blue throw. This was the place where he had come to dream, away from the demands of the family and the weight of his own reputation. And now it was mine. I walked over to the drafting table and traced my finger through the dust. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss, a realization that the man who had built this sanctuary was gone. But underneath the grief, there was a fierce, protective pride. He had left me his most precious possession. He had left me his silence. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. Marcus was a creature of habit, and his habit was to escalate when he felt his authority being challenged. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. 4 missed calls from Marcus. 3 from Elena. A dozen text messages ranging from "we need to talk" to "you're making a huge mistake." I sat down on the sofa and opened the first message from Marcus. He was threatening to file an injunction. He was calling my actions unconscionable and a betrayal of our father's legacy. I felt a dry, humorless laugh bubble up in my chest. He was talking about legacy as if it were a bank account. He didn't understand that a legacy is something you build with your hands, not something you inherit with a signature. I thought about the time Marcus tried to talk Dad into selling his collection of rare architectural books. He had called them clutter and told Dad that they were just taking up space that could be used for a more modern home office. Dad had been so hurt he hadn't spoken for 2 days. I was the one who spent the weekend cleaning and cataloging every single volume, making sure Dad knew that his treasures were safe with me. Marcus hadn't even noticed they were gone. He only cared about the space they occupied, not the knowledge they contained. Now, those books were sitting in the safe in the house, and I was the only one with the key. I felt a cold, sharp sense of satisfaction. Marcus was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. I went to the kitchenette and found a bottle of scotch hidden in the back of a cupboard. I poured myself a small glass and took it back to the window. The city was a sea of lights, a vast, interconnected web of lives and stories that had nothing to do with me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of scale. My problems, my family, the house, it was all so small compared to the pulse of the world outside. I realized that I had spent 5 years looking through a magnifying glass at a single, dying flame. Now, I was looking at the sun. I took a sip of the scotch. It was old and smoky, burning a path down my throat that felt like a purification. I was done with the smallness. I was done with the service. I'm curious. Have you ever walked away from something that everyone else thought was your whole world? Have you ever felt that terrifying, exhilarating moment when you realize that the cage door has been open the whole time? It's a strange kind of vertigo, isn't it? The world is so much bigger than the space we're told to occupy. I'd love to hear about the moments you decided to stop being the person everyone expected you to be. Tell me your stories in the comments. It makes me feel like I'm not the only one navigating this new, wide-open space. I went to the drafting table and turned on the small, green-shaded lamp. The light was warm and focused, creating a small island of clarity in the darkened room. I found a stack of clean vellum and a set of drawing pencils in the drawer. My hands were steady. I picked up a pencil and felt the familiar weight of it, the way the wood felt against my callus. I didn't try to draw anything complicated. I just drew a single, straight line. Then another. And another. I felt the tension leaving my shoulders, replaced by a rhythmic, meditative focus. I was an architect. I was a designer. I was a builder. Those things hadn't disappeared. They had just been waiting for the light to come back on. I remember the day I told my boss I was leaving. He had been a mentor to me, a man who saw the potential in my sketches before I even did. He had told me that I was making a mistake, that I was throwing away a career that most people would kill for. I had told him that I didn't have a choice. I had told him that my family needed me. He had looked at me with a kind of sad pity and said, "Sarah, families like yours don't need you. They consume you." I hadn't understood what he meant then. I had thought he was being cynical. Now, looking at the straight lines on the vellum, I realized he was right. They hadn't needed my care. They had needed my absence so they could feel more present. They had used my sacrifice to subsidize their own luxury. I set the pencil down and looked at the phone again. Marcus was calling. I watched the screen glow. In the dark, the name Marcus pulsing like a warning light. I let it ring. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't care what he had to say. He was a man who only spoke when he wanted something, and I had nothing left to give him. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The only power he had over me was the power I gave him. And I was taking it back. I reached out and turned the phone off. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I walked back to the sofa and lay down, pulling the navy blue throw over my legs. The fabric was soft and smelled of cedar. I looked up at the ceiling, at the ornate plasterwork that my father had loved so much. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. I was in my own place. I was on my own time. I was Sarah again. I closed my eyes and let the sounds of the city drift up to the 12th floor, the sirens, the honking, the distant roar of the world moving forward. I wasn't afraid of the morning. I wasn't afraid of the meetings or the legal battles or the long road ahead. I was ready. I was finally, truly ready. I thought about the house, standing dark and empty in the suburbs. I thought about the room where my father had died, the room where I had spent so many nights counting his breaths. That house was a monument to the past, a mausoleum of duty and regret. This room was a blueprint for the future. It was a place where things were made, not just maintained. I felt a sudden, fierce desire to start working, to see what I could create with the 5 years of experience I had gained in the shadows. I wasn't the same woman who had left 5 years ago. I was stronger. I was sharper. I was a woman who knew how to build a foundation that couldn't be shaken. The morning would come soon enough, bringing with it the lawyers and the paperwork and the inevitable confrontations. But for now, there was just the quiet and the light from the city. I drifted off to sleep with the image of a bridge in my mind, a bridge that connected the woman I was to the woman I was becoming. It was a beautiful structure, elegant and strong, built to last. I was the architect. I was the builder. And I was already halfway across. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of the city waking up. The light was different now, a cold, gray dawn that filtered through the window and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. I felt refreshed, as if I had slept for a week instead of just a few hours. I stood up and stretched, my muscles feeling long and limber. I went to the window and looked down at the street. People were already moving, a steady stream of figures heading toward the subway and the coffee shops. They were all going somewhere. They all had a purpose. And for the first time in 5 years, so did I. I turned on the light in the kitchenette and started the coffee maker. The smell of the brewing beans was a promise. It was the smell of a new day. I reached for my phone and turned it back on. It took a moment for the messages to flood in, a frantic, digital assault that I met with a calm, steady gaze. I didn't read them. I just deleted them. All of them. Except for one. It was a message from an old colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It said, "Sarah, I heard you're back in the city. We're looking for a lead designer for the new library project. Are you interested?" I looked at the message for a long time, the words blurring as my eyes filled with tears. He had remembered. The world hadn't forgotten me. I sat down at the drafting table and typed a reply. "Yes," I wrote. "I'm very interested." I hit send. The weight of the last 5 years didn't disappear, but it shifted. It became a part of me, a foundation rather than a burden. I looked at the straight lines I had drawn on the vellum. They were the first lines of a new story. They were the lines of a life that was mine to design. I took a sip of my coffee and looked out at the skyline. The sun was just starting to hit the tops of the buildings, turning the glass into gold. It was a beautiful sight. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. I was home. I was finally, truly home. The lobby of the law firm was a cathedral of brushed steel and frosted glass, a space designed to make ordinary people feel small and unimportant. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the yellow veins of taxis pulsing through the dark canyons of Park Avenue. The city felt different today. It didn't feel like a distraction or a distant memory. It felt like a map of my future. I could see the silhouette of the Chrysler Building, its tiered arches gleaming like silver armor against the bruised purple of the morning sky. My reflection in the glass was sharp. The charcoal suit fit better than I remembered, or perhaps I was just standing taller. I looked like the woman I was 5 years ago, but there was a hardness in my eyes now that hadn't been there before. I wasn't just a designer anymore. I was a survivor. My heart was a steady, heavy drum in my chest, a rhythm of anticipation that made my fingertips hum. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my spine, cold against my skin. I didn't move. I waited. The receptionist, a woman with hair so perfectly blonde it looked synthetic, signaled me toward the conference room. I walked with a measured pace, my heels clicking a sharp, unforgiving rhythm on the marble floor. As I approached the heavy oak doors, I heard the muffled sound of Marcus's voice. He was shouting. Even through 2 inches of solid wood, his entitlement was loud and abrasive. I paused for a split second, my hand hovering over the brass handle. I felt a sudden, fleeting memory of a Christmas Eve 3 years ago. Dad had been confused, crying because he couldn't remember where he had hidden my mother's ornaments. Marcus and Elena had been in the next room, laughing loudly over expensive scotch, refusing to come in because they didn't want to ruin the mood. I had spent 3 hours on my hands and knees in the dusty attic, searching for a box that didn't exist, just to calm a dying man's heart. They hadn't even looked up when I came downstairs, covered in cobwebs and shivering. They hadn't cared. I pushed the door open. The room was a battleground. Marcus was standing at the head of the table, flanked by a man in a $3,000 suit who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Elena was seated to his left, her face a mask of cold fury. Her fingers drummed incessantly on the leather surface of the table. Mr. Henderson sat at the opposite end, his face as unreadable as a tombstone. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the ozone of high-tension electricity. Marcus stopped mid-sentence when I walked in. He looked at me, his eyes scanning my suit, his lip curling in a sneer that didn't quite hide the fear underneath. He told me I was late. He told me that his time was worth more than this entire building. He was lying. He was terrified. I didn't apologize. I didn't even look at him. I sat down next to Mr. Henderson and placed my leather-bound notebook on the table. It looked small and battered in this room of luxury, but it was the only thing that mattered. Marcus's lawyer cleared his throat, a sound like gravel in a blender. He started talking about procedural irregularities and coercive environments. He spoke about my father as if he were a piece of evidence, not a human being. He used long, winding sentences designed to confuse and intimidate. I watched the way his gold watch caught the light. It was distracting. He was a predator. I was bored. I waited for him to finish his opening salvo, my hands folded perfectly on top of my notebook. I felt the familiar thud-thud-thud of my pulse in my throat, but I kept my breathing shallow. I thought about the time Elena had asked me to iron her dress for a charity gala while I was in the middle of administering Dad's breathing treatment. She had told me it was critical networking for her brand. She had said that since I was just sitting there, I could make myself useful. I had ironed the dress. I had watched her walk out the door, smelling of perfume and ego, while I sat in the dark and listened to the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine. That memory was a cold, hard coal in my chest. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. I slid it across the table toward Marcus's lawyer. "What is this?" Marcus hissed. He reached for it, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm to stop him. I looked at Marcus, my gaze level and cold. I told him it was the footage. I told him it was 4 hours of our father, recorded 2 weeks before he died, explaining in excruciating detail why he was doing this. I told him that Dad had spent 30 minutes just talking about the time Marcus had asked for his inheritance early so he could cover his gambling debts in Macau. I saw the blood drain from Marcus's face. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. He didn't know about the debts. He didn't know I knew. He thought his secrets were buried in a digital vault, but Dad had been the one who paid the bills. Dad had kept the receipts. The room went silent, a heavy, suffocating quiet that made the hum of the air conditioning sound like a roar. Elena was staring at Marcus, her mouth open in a silent "oh" of shock. She hadn't known either. The perfect brother, the partner, the kingmaker, was nothing more than a desperate man drowning in debt. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, electric buzz that made my skin tingle. It was the feeling of a structure finally collapsing under its own weight. I told them that the video was ironclad. I told them that Mr. Henderson had witnessed the entire thing and that it had been cross-referenced with Dad's neurological evaluations from that same week. I told them that there was no undue influence. There was only clarity. "You think you're so smart, Sarah," Elena spat. Her voice was trembling now, her composure finally cracking. She told me that I had stolen their lives. She told me that she was going to lose her apartment, her car, her status. She spoke as if these were basic human rights that I had snatched away out of spite. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel any guilt. I didn't feel the need to fix it. I told her that she hadn't lost her life. She had just lost the subsidy for it. I told her that she was 40 years old, and it was time she learned how to pay for her own jasmine perfume. I saw her flinch as if I had slapped her. It was a beautiful moment. It was the moment I stopped being the good daughter and started being the woman who won. Marcus's lawyer leaned back, his granite face finally showing a crack of doubt. He whispered something to Marcus, a quick, hushed conversation that ended with Marcus slamming his fist onto the table. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I just waited for the noise to settle. I told them that I had a proposal. I told them that I was willing to waive the repayment of the loans Dad had given them over the last decade in exchange for their immediate and permanent withdrawal of any claims against the estate. I told them they had 10 minutes to decide. If they didn't sign the agreement, I would release the video and the financial records to the board of Marcus's firm and the press. I wasn't asking. I was dictating. I'm curious. Have you ever had to be the one to deliver the truth to people who have lived a lie for decades? It's a heavy responsibility, but there's a strange, cold peace in it. It's the peace of a surgeon cutting away the rot to save the body. I'd love to hear about the times you've had to be the bad guy to get to the truth. Let me know in the comments. It helps to know that I'm not the only one who has had to burn a bridge to find the way home. Marcus looked at the agreement. His hand was shaking so badly he had to grip the table to steady himself. He looked at his lawyer, seeking a lifeline that wasn't there. The lawyer just shook his head, a slow, definitive movement that signaled the end of the road. Marcus looked at me then, and for a second, I saw the little boy who used to hide behind me when he broke a window. I saw the vulnerability he had spent a lifetime trying to bury under a mountain of money and ego. But the feeling passed quickly. I remembered the cold nights in the house. I remembered the isolation. I remembered the way he had laughed at my little projects. I didn't feel pity. I felt finished. He picked up the pen. The scratching of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the room. He signed his name, the letters jagged and messy. Then he pushed the paper toward Elena. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at me. She just signed it, her movements mechanical and stiff. When they were done, Mr. Henderson took the papers and checked the signatures. He gave a small, satisfied nod. It was over. The house, the accounts, the studio, the future, it was all legally, irrevocably mine. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of exhaustion, a realization that I had been holding my breath for 5 years and I could finally let it out. They stood up to leave. Marcus tried to say something, a final parting shot about family and loyalty, but the words died in his throat. He looked at me, and I saw the moment he realized that he didn't know who I was anymore. He had spent 5 years treating me like a servant, and he hadn't noticed the architect building a prison for him in the shadows. They walked out of the room, their shadows trailing behind them like ghosts. I sat there for a long time after the door clicked shut. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a completed project. It was the silence of a clean slate. Mr. Henderson looked at me over his glasses. He told me I had handled that well. He told me that my father would have been proud of the way I protected the legacy. I thanked him, but I knew that I hadn't done it for the legacy. I had done it for myself. I had done it for the woman who had sat in the dark and counted the minutes until the morning. I stood up and gathered my things. My notebook felt lighter now, its pages filled with the weight of a war that was finally over. I walked out of the conference room and back through the lobby. The sun was higher now, the light reflecting off the steel and glass in a blinding, golden display. I walked out onto Park Avenue and breathed in the cold, sharp air of the city. It smelled of coffee and exhaust and possibility. I felt a sudden, fierce sense of ownership. This city was mine. This life was mine. I started walking toward the subway, my heels clicking on the pavement with a new, confident rhythm. I wasn't going back to the house tonight. I was going to my studio. I was going to order a pizza and sit on the floor and look at the blueprints for the library project. I was going to draw a line. That was perfectly straight. I was going to build something that would outlast the grief and the anger and the noise. I thought about the house in the suburbs, standing empty and dark. I would sell it. I would let someone else fill those rooms with their own stories and their own secrets. I didn't need it anymore. I had the keys to a different kind of home now. I felt a smile touch my lips, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I was 38 years old, and my life was just beginning. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool metal of the studio keys. I was home. I was finally, truly home. The crowd on the sidewalk was a sea of moving bodies, everyone headed toward their own destination. I merged into the flow, a single point of light in the vast, interconnected web of the city. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a person. I was Sarah. And for the first time in 5 years, I knew exactly where I was going. I stepped onto the escalator and felt the world moving beneath my feet. It was a good feeling. It was the feeling of moving forward. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The future was ahead of me, bright and sharp and full of promise. And I was ready for it. I was more than ready. I sat at the drafting table in the studio, the light from the desk lamp carving a sharp circle of clarity against the twilight that had settled over the city. Outside the window, the skyline was beginning to glow, 1,000 windows flickering to life like a constellation of grounded stars. The silence here was different than the silence of the house. In the house, the quiet was heavy, weighted with the expectation of a cough, a groan, or the frantic beep of a medical monitor. Here, the quiet was expansive. It was the silence of a blank page, waiting for the first line of a new design. I picked up my favorite drafting pencil, the one with the worn silver clip, and felt the weight of it in my palm. My hands were steady. They didn't shake with the exhaustion of lifting a man twice my size or the anxiety of a bank account that was nearly empty. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest, a rhythmic fluttering that I realized was excitement. It had been a long time since I felt that. I remembered the day I handed the keys of the family house to the real estate agent. It was a Tuesday, a crisp morning where the frost still clung to the overgrown grass in the garden. I had walked through every room one last time, my footsteps echoing in the empty space where the furniture used to be. I stood in Dad's study and looked at the spot where the mahogany desk had sat for 40 years. The floor was a lighter shade of wood there, a rectangular ghost of a life that was finally over. I didn't feel sad. I felt a profound sense of relief, a shedding of a skin that no longer fit me. I remembered the injustice of the dust motes dancing in the morning light, the same dust I had spent 5 years trying to control, now settling over the emptiness, as if I had never been there at all. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me. I didn't look back. I was done being a curator of ghosts. Marcus had called me that morning. I didn't answer, but he left a voicemail that I listened to while sitting in my car at the end of the driveway. His voice was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a whining, desperate tone that made him sound small. He told me that his firm was restructuring and that he needed a short-term loan to bridge the gap. He used the word family 5 times in a 3-minute message. He spoke as if the meeting in the lawyer's office had never happened. He spoke as if I were still the same Sarah who would sell her own soul to keep the peace. I deleted the message before it even finished playing. I felt a cold, sharp sense of finality. He wasn't my brother anymore. He was just a man who didn't know how to live without someone else's money. The silence after the message ended was beautiful. I'm curious. Have you ever reached that point where you realize that the word family is being used as a weapon against you? Have you ever had to be the one to finally say enough? It's a terrifying thing to do, but once you do it, you realize the power was always yours. I'd love to know how you handled the fallout of setting a boundary that no one expected you to keep. Let me know in the comments. We're all building our own structures here, and sometimes you have to clear the site before you can start. Your stories give me strength. I looked down at the vellum on my drafting table. I had been working on the preliminary sketches for the new library project for 3 days. It was a massive undertaking, a building that needed to be both a sanctuary for books and a modern hub for the community. I wanted it to be full of light. I wanted the walls to feel like they were breathing. I drew a long, sweeping curve that represented the main atrium, the lines smooth and confident. I thought about the way Dad used to talk about architecture. He said that a building is only as strong as its foundation. If the foundation is built on lies or secrets, the whole thing will eventually crumble, no matter how beautiful the facade. I realized that my own life had been a series of beautiful facades built on a foundation of resentment and duty. Now, I was building something real. I was building on the truth. Elena sent me a photo of her new apartment. It was a small, 1-bedroom place in a part of the city she used to mock. She didn't say anything, just sent the photo as if she were expecting me to feel sorry for her. I looked at the cluttered space, the boxes stacked in the corner, and the cheap lighting. I remembered the way she used to walk into the family home, draped in designer labels, complaining about the shabby state of the furniture I was keeping clean for her. I didn't feel bad for her. I felt a sense of justice that was as sharp as a diamond. She was finally experiencing the reality I had lived for 5 years. She was learning the value of $1 and the weight of an empty room. I didn't reply to the photo. I just put my phone face down on the desk and went back to my work. I was tired of being the person who fixed everyone else's messes. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of a rainy night during Dad's final year. He had been agitated, convinced that the house was on fire. I had stayed up with him until dawn, holding his hand and telling him stories about the houses I wanted to build. He had looked at me with a moment of pure clarity and said, "Sarah, don't let the walls of this house become your prison." I hadn't understood it then. I had thought he was just rambling. Now, sitting in my studio, I realized it was the most important thing he ever told me. He knew that the care I was giving him was a cage. He knew that Marcus and Elena were the bars. He had spent his final months making sure I had the key. I felt a tear prick at my eye, but I didn't let it fall. I smiled instead. He had been my accomplice. We had outsmarted them together. The city outside was now a tapestry of light. I stood up and walked to the window, leaning my forehead against the cool glass. I could see the cars moving on the street below, the headlights like a river of gold flowing toward the horizon. I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. I was 38 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I wasn't waiting for someone to wake up, or someone to call, or someone to tell me I was doing a good job. I was the architect of my own day. I was the master of my own time. I felt a surge of energy, a physical lightness that made me want to dance. I turned on the small radio in the corner, and a slow, jazzy melody filled the room. I hummed along, the sound vibrating in my chest. I thought about the future. There would be more legal battles, probably. Marcus wouldn't go quietly, and Elena would eventually try to sue for a share of the jewelry. But I wasn't afraid. I had the documents, I had the video, and I had the best legal representation Dad's money could buy. More importantly, I had the truth. You can't argue with the truth once it's been recorded and signed in a room full of witnesses. I was protected. I was secure. I was free. I looked at the keys to the studio sitting on the edge of the desk. They weren't just metal. They were a promise. A promise that I would never let myself be small again. I went back to the drafting table and picked up my pencil. I had a library to design. I had a city to build. I had a life to live. I drew a final, definitive line on the vellum, the sound of the pencil against the paper a sharp, satisfying scratch. It was the last line of the atrium. It was the first line of my future. I felt a sense of completion wash over me, a feeling of a project finally finished. I was no longer the daughter who stayed. I was the woman who left, and in leaving, I had finally found my way home. The light from the lamp stayed bright as I worked late into the night, the only sound the rhythmic scratch of the pencil and the distant, comforting hum of the city that was finally mine. I stopped for a moment and looked at my hands. They were the same hands that had changed bandages and administered morphine. They were the same hands that had scrubbed floors and ironed Elena's dresses. But they were also the hands that had designed a skyscraper and a museum. They were strong. They were capable. They were mine. I realized that the 5 years I spent in the house hadn't been a waste. They had been a forge. They had burned away the weakness and the doubt, leaving behind something tempered and unbreakable. I was a better architect because I knew what it meant to build a sanctuary. I was a better woman because I knew what it meant to survive a war. I took a deep breath, the air in the studio smelling of ozone and possibility. As I sat there, the moon rose over the buildings, a pale, silver orb that watched over the city. I felt a connection to everyone out there, every person who was working late, every person who was starting over, every person who was building something from nothing. We were all architects in our own way. We were all trying to create something that would last. I hoped that my library would be a place where people like me could go to find the silence they needed to hear their own thoughts. I hoped it would be a place where the foundation was strong enough to hold up any dream. I put the pencil down and turned off the desk lamp. The room was bathed in the soft, silver glow of the moonlight. I sat in the dark for a long time, just breathing. I realized that this was the end of the script Marcus and Elena had written for me. I had torn up their version of my life and thrown it away. I was writing the next chapter now, and it was going to be magnificent. I stood up and walked to the door, my heels clicking on the floor with a sharp, final rhythm. I turned off the light in the kitchenette and locked the door of the studio. The sound of the bolt clicking home was a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I walked toward the elevator, the hallway quiet and still. I was ready for the morning. I was ready for everything. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, I saw my reflection in the polished metal. I looked tired, but I looked happy. I looked like a woman who had won. I leaned back against the wall of the elevator and felt the smooth, downward motion. The city was waiting for me. The world was waiting for me. And I wasn't going to keep it waiting any longer. I walked out of the building and into the cool, night air of Park Avenue. I started walking, my pace steady and strong. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where I was going. Thank you for being here with me through this long, dark night. I hope my story reminded you that even when the walls feel like they're closing in, there's always a way out. You just have to be the one to find the key. I'm Sarah, and this is my life. It's not perfect, but it's mine. And that's the most beautiful structure of all. Good night, and remember to keep building. I'll see you in the next design. I disappeared into the crowd on the sidewalk, a single, glowing light in the vast, interconnected web of the city. I was free. I was finally, truly free. The pavement felt solid beneath my feet. The air felt clean in my lungs. I was home. I was finally truly home.